I love the passion and dedication that Crash Bandicoot fans have. They get really serious about the most important and vital aspects of the franchise, like lore and continuity. Wait, what? Yeah, despite Crash Bandicoot never really having what I'd call a consistent timeline or a focus on story, I feel like I've seen a lot of people get very up in arms about it. Granted, I take most of what I read on social media with a grain of salt, but why else would I have seen so many people angrily complain about Crash 4 ruining the timeline by erasing the other games from the canon? Like, those games still exist, you guys. You can still play them. I do. Now, while I do think it's silly how seriously people take continuity in a series that's had more developers than I have brain cells, I'd be lying if I said I didn't care at all. I think piecing together a coherent Crash timeline is a fun little puzzle, so I took it upon myself to vigorously scour every bit of Crash lore across the games and supplementary material for the sake of this thought experiment. Okay, not really. There's a lot of pretty easy lines to work with, and I did a minor bit of research beyond that. Keep in mind that while a lot of this can be proven as fact, there's still quite a lot of speculation on my part, and unless we get some kind of Hyrule Historia-esque book that contains an official Crash Bandicoot timeline, this can't be seen as the complete objective truth. I'm sure there could be some details I missed, or that things could be interpreted in a different way. This is just my take on it. Also, for the sake of not making things too confusing, you can go ahead and consider the remakes of the Naughty Dog games as the same thing as their PS1 counterparts. With that said, let's get started.
From humble beginnings.
So, to the surprise of nobody, Crash Bandicoot 1 is the first game in the timeline, followed by Crash Bandicoot 2, and then followed by Crash Bandicoot 3. I feel like this is obvious enough. Crash 1 is Crash's origin story, and it, alongside the other two games of the PS1 trilogy, form a cohesive and locked continuity. Crash 2 immediately begins where Crash 1 ended, with Cortex falling from the airship after his defeat before having a 1-year time skip. Likewise, Crash 3 begins where Crash 2 ended, with the destroyed space station plummeting towards Earth. A small thing of note is that the true endings for Crash 2 and 3 are their 100% endings, whereas for Crash 1, it's the non-100% ending. Crash 1's 100% ending has Crash fly off into the night with Tawna while never actually confronting Cortex, and that directly contradicts the opening of Crash 2. So the 100% ending of Crash 1 is essentially non-canon. This is an outlier because for every other game that actually has a different 100% ending, with the possible exception of Crash 4, 100% ending is the true ending. This doesn't really affect anything, but I thought I'd just point that out. After Crash 3, we have our first split in the timeline. Yeah, as far as I interpret things, the Crash timeline does have branches in it. And you know, I embrace the branches. I've seen some people in the past very vigorously try to fit every game in the series on one straight line, and I just don't think there's enough consistency between what every developer was trying to do for that to really work. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Branching timelines and alternate continuities aren't exactly foreign to media or storytelling, so I don't think there's anything wrong with Crash following suit. Hell, I honestly think it's a miracle that Crash's timeline isn't an indecipherable mess, considering how often the franchise traded hands between developers. But I digress. Like I said, after Crash 3, the timeline splits into two separate paths. I'm going to talk about the more recent path first because it's also the shorter of the two, and that path begins with Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. Crash 4 is deliberately set up as a true sequel to Crash 3. All of the previous games that came out after Crash 3 but before Crash 4 didn't really have a strong tie to the former lore-wise, and Crash 4 rectifies that by, much like the PS1 games before it, picking up where Crash 3 ended, with Cortex, Entropy, and Uka Uka having spent literal decades trying to escape the time prison they were trapped in at the end of the previous game. Now, I will mention that there is the possibility that Crash 4 does exist on the same timeline as all of the Crash games that came out in the 2000s, and simply takes place before all of them. There isn't anything that really contradicts this, but I have the gut feeling that if Toys for Bob continues working on the series, they're going to keep their own story going from Crash 4 with not too much direct relation to that era of games. So I think it makes more sense to treat Crash 4 as its own continuity separate from the 2000s era games. I could totally be proven wrong in the future though, and I don't think anyone's wrong for thinking Crash 4 fits cleanly onto the same timeline as the older games. Before moving on to the other branch of the timeline, I do want to talk about the flashback tapes, even though they aren't technically their own individual games. These are thankfully pretty easy to place. All of Crash's tapes occur before Crash 1, with the last one even occurring on the same day that Crash 1 begins. Coco's are a bit harder to pinpoint, but the dates shown tell us that they begin to take place concurrently with Crash 1 and continue until a few months before Crash 2. These are probably only canon on the same branch of the timeline as Crash 4, but for the sake of keeping things simple, I'll go ahead and just plop these in their appropriate spots around Crash 1. Now let's jump back to the other branch that follows Crash 3. The next game on this branch is Crash Team Racing. Now you might be wondering, wait, why is CTR only on this branch? Oxide appears in Crash 4, so obviously CTR has to be canon there too. Well, it's not that simple. As previously established, Crash 4 is a direct sequel to Crash 3, picking up exactly where the latter left off, and because of that, no game, including CTR, can occur between the two. As for Oxide's appearance in Crash 4, notice how none of the heroes act like they've met him in the past. Considering how he tried to turn Earth into a parking lot in CTR, you'd think they'd be like, Oxide, what's he doing here? Or something, similar to how Coco reacted to seeing Dingodile, but they don't really acknowledge Oxide at all. As far as they're concerned, he's just some henchman working for the Entropies and nothing else, so with that small detail, a major continuity snarl is avoided. That's all well and good, but what makes CTR canon? Two things to note. The first and most blatantly obvious is the fact that Oxide appears in later games. His appearance on the boot up screen of Wrath of Cortex is pretty minor, but he straight up attends Crash's birthday party at the start of Twinsanity, and is also a major character in Crash Nitro Kart. He has to exist and have a history with Crash for these appearances to make sense, so CTR has to have happened. The other detail that leads me to conclude that CTR is canon is in this shot of the opening of Wrath of Cortex. There's a racing trophy on top of the fireplace in Crash and Coco's house. Thus, the race for the planet happened at some point before Wrath of Cortex. Quick side note, this also means the canonical winner of the race is either Crash, Coco, Polar, or Purah. It's probably Coco because she's awesome, but I suppose it could have been any of them. One final note before I move on, but I want to address Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled, specifically the Grand Prix events. I mentioned at the start of the video that I was considering remakes to be the same thing as their originals, but in the case of CTR, I'm containing this strictly to the events of Adventure Mode. Factoring in every single character, skin, track, etc. from the Grand Prix, fitting all of that into the timeline is a gigantic mess. There's so many references to games that take place after CTR that the Grand Prix can't possibly occur at the same time as Adventure Mode. I think it's easiest to just assume that anything that's not part of Adventure Mode itself is non-canon. Hell, even Adventure Mode in Nitro Fueled plays dangerously with the canon, considering the fact that you can play as literally anyone in that mode, including Oxide. So now we move on to the next game on this branch of the timeline, Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex. Some of you may call it the real Crash Bandicoot 4, and if you do that unironically,
stop it. Get some help.
Wrath of Cortex is a pretty easy game to slot into the timeline. Even though there isn't really a direct relation to the previous games in the series, the handful of references that I've already mentioned and the presence of characters only introduced in Crash 3 put it firmly after the original trilogy in Crash Team Racing. And from there we have another branch in the timeline. So, post-release of Wrath of Cortex is about where the franchise constantly trading hands caused quite a bit of continuity snarl. The biggest culprit of this is the next game on one side of the branch, Crash Bandicoot: The Huge Adventure. I want to give particular attention to this game's release date, which was only 4 months after the Wrath of Cortex. The reasonable conclusion here is that this game was in development at the same time as Wrath of Cortex, and was intended to just be an unrelated alternate sequel to the trilogy. Case in point, nothing in The Huge Adventure has any relation to the Wrath of Cortex, with no new characters or elements from the latter making an appearance in the former. With that said, why does The Huge Adventure take place after Wrath of Cortex? Well, it actually has nothing to do with The Huge Adventure itself, but rather the game that came after it, Entranced. This game is the direct sequel to The Huge Adventure, with the opening cutscene even directly referencing the events of that game. Uka Uka even calls Cortex's plan to shrink the Earth his last scheme, so Entrance has to be a direct sequel to The Huge Adventure. But this causes a problem with a certain character who appears in Entrance but not The Huge Adventure, and that character is Crunch. Crunch makes his debut in The Wrath of Cortex, serving as Crash's primary enemy throughout the game until being freed from Cortex's control and becoming an ally at the end of it. When you save Crunch in Entrance, he even makes reference to this by saying that he was brainwashed again. Because of that, Entrance has to take place after The Wrath of Cortex, but it also takes place directly after The Huge Adventure. Thus, The Huge Adventure has to come after Wrath of Cortex. So what was Crunch up to in Huge Adventure? Honestly, there's no good explanation. The real world reason is obviously that Crunch simply didn't exist during the game's development, and when they made the sequel they decided to add him to maintain some continuity with games that had already been released. But as far as lore goes, this is simply one of the series' biggest plot holes, if not the biggest. The best explanation I can come up with is that Crunch was around but not involved in the events of The Huge Adventure. I don't know, maybe he was like taking a nap the whole time or something. Maybe the events of The Huge Adventure take place so soon after Wrath of Cortex that he's in no condition to help. I really couldn't tell you. There's no clean solution, and this is simply the best I could come up with. But with that tangled mess out of the way, there's one more game on this branch before we double back to the other branch, and that game is Crash Nitro Kart. The biggest indicator that this takes place after Entranced is simply that Entranced is in the game as a playable character. Since Entranced is his introduction, I'd say that that's a pretty simple conclusion to draw. Fittingly, this branch in the timeline consists of the first 3 games made by Vicarious Visions, so they clearly had their own little bit of continuity going on. So let's double back to the other branch that stems from the Wrath of Cortex. This is the branch that I consider the main series timeline, because this is where all the main series games take place. And the first game after Wrath of Cortex on this timeline is, of course, Crash Twinsanity, which is actually the direct sequel to the former. It's a lot more subtle about this compared to other games that are direct sequels, but it's easy to tell by the fact that Twinsanity opens with Cortex and Uka Uka frozen in an iceberg, with their fate at the end of Wrath of Cortex being trapped in the frozen Antarctic waste. The game also makes note that 3 years have passed since this happens, which ties into Twinsanity being released 3 years after the Wrath of Cortex. It is technically possible for the Vicarious Visions games to also exist on this timeline and simply take place after Twinsanity, but you would run into the same problem the Huge Adventure has with Wrath of Cortex, and I would rather have that be the exception than the rule. Funnily enough, Entrance was apparently supposed to make a cameo appearance in Twinsanity and got cut, and I'm honestly glad he was, both because his presence would make an even bigger continuity snarl than Crunch's absence in the Huge Adventure, and because his intended cameo sounds pretty disgusting. The next game on the timeline is one that I'm a bit unsure about, and that's Crash Tag Team Racing. It has nothing to do with its placement on the timeline because it clearly takes place after Twinsanity. I'm more so not 100% certain that this game is canon. It's definitely one of the most out there in terms of character personalities and plot, and future games make little to no reference to it. However, there are some things from this game that carry over into future games that make me lean more towards it being canon. The most blatant example of this is Nina's new personality, as well as the tweaks that were made to the other characters carrying over in some way to Crash of the Titans. Additionally, when Tiny confronts you in the latter game, he mentions being hurt over how he wasn't invited to the last game, clearly referencing his absence in Tag Team Racing. He could be talking about Boom Bang, but I think it's best if we all forget about that game. Now, obviously, that's just supposed to be a thrown-in fourth-wall-breaking joke, and how it affects canon should be taken with a grain of salt, but it does make me assume that the events of Tag Team Racing happen. But at the same time, Fawn Clutch mentions having all of Cortex's games, which means the Crash Bandicoot games exist in Tag Team Racing, which means if it's canon, then the Crash Bandicoot games canonically exist in the Crash Bandicoot universe, and good god, it's just a complete mess. I remember reading somewhere a long time ago that the developers at Radical Entertainment outright said that Tag Team Racing was non-canon, but I've never seen any source supporting this claim, and I'm pretty sure I read it on an older version of Crash Mania. I don't think the site mentions it now, so I'm not going to put any stock into an unverified claim. I'm just going to go ahead and slot Tag Team Racing as maybe canon. Its status on the timeline is unclear, but if it is canon, then it firmly sits between Twinsanity and the next game on the timeline. The next game, of course, being Crash of the Titans. This game was clearly intended to be a soft reboot, which if you're unfamiliar with the term, a soft reboot is when an entry in a series continues from the same continuity, but is reset to a new status quo. Crash of the Titans fits this definition to a T. It massively revamps everything about the series, but still maintains enough references to past games to make it clear that it's in the same continuity. The best examples of this are Uka Uka mentioning Crash's history with the Evolve Array, and Tiny's previously mentioned reference to Tag Team Racing, if you want to count that. Additionally, there's apparently a bit of dialogue from one of the minions that mentions how Uka Uka used an ice body in Twinsanity, but there's like literally hundreds of these little dialogue bits, and I can't be bothered digging for it. And easily enough from there, Mind Over Mutant follows Crash of the Titans. It's quite literally a direct sequel to Titans, in a similar vein to the PS1 trilogy and GBA duology, so nothing really to be said there. We're almost done, but there's still a few games to talk about. First up is Crash Bash. This game has two endings, and regardless of which one happens, no game can realistically follow off from it. Either good prevails and Aku Aku banishes Uka Uka into the void of space permanently, or evil prevails and Uka Uka achieves world domination. The presence of Oxide as a final boss, for whatever reason, implies that it has to take place after CTR, so I guess you could include this little tiny nub in the timeline that just has Bash and nothing else, but at that point I'd rather just go ahead and label this as non-canon. Next up is Crash Purple. This game doesn't really have much indication of where it goes on the timeline, except for that it has to take place after the Wrath of Cortex due to Crunch's presence, but its nature as a crossover with Spyro, as well as the fact that no other game ever directly references it, makes me prefer to label it as non-canon as well. Crash Boom Bang is non-canon. Moving on. The GBA and DS versions of Crash of the Titans and Mind Over Mutant are all their own separate continuities from their console counterparts and each other, so I'm going to label all of them as non-canon as well. I want to briefly touch upon Crash Team Rumble. The game's nature is a 4v4 battle arena game where any assortment of characters, regardless of alignment, can team up leads me to believe it's not supposed to be a canon game. However, there has been a concerted effort on the devs' part to provide some kind of lore between this little blurb on the Q&A explaining how the Rumble even began and the webcomic explaining Cat-Bat's origins. I'm not 100% confident that Rumble is canon to the timeline, and even if it is, the fact that it's stated to draw contestants from all dimensions means that it could potentially be anywhere. However, I'd say it most likely takes place in the same branch as Crash 4 and after it, given that the alternate versions of Tana and Entropy are both present. And that leaves just the mobile phone games. I'm gonna be honest, I didn't really think much on these. I was just gonna throw the 5 bajillion games named Crash Nitro Kart into the non-canon bin as well, but there is one particular mobile game that I do need to acknowledge, and that's Crash Bandicoot On the Run. The creative lead of the game, when asked, explicitly stated, "The game sits at the center of the multiverse, where anything that has ever happened in the Crash multiverse could crash into On the Run." Because of this, On the Run canonically takes place after every single game in the timeline and brings them all back together onto a single branch. Wait. Does this mean Crash Bandicoot On the Run is the Breath of the Wild of the Crash Bandicoot timeline? Huh. That's not a sentence I was expecting to say. And with that, I think we're done. A complete and cohesive Crash Bandicoot timeline for all to enjoy. I certainly had a lot of fun making this, and I hope you all had fun watching this video. Again, keep in mind that this is all mostly speculation, and I could have missed some detail or forgotten something, so feel free to leave a comment about how you felt about my take on the timeline. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more Crash Bandicoot content. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.